De retour sur Africa 24, l'Assemblée générale des Nations Unies se poursuit. Africa 24 vous propose de suivre le débat toujours en direct de New York.
The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Jacob Zuma, President of the Republic of South Africa. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome to the United Nations His Excellency Jacob Zuma, President of the Republic of South Africa, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
Thank you very much, Chair, Your Excellency, Ambassador Peter Thompson, President of the General Assembly, Your Excellency, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General of the United Nations, Your Majesties, Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to congratulate you, Mr. President, on your election as the President of the 71st session of the General Assembly. I assure you of South Africa's continued support in the implementation of your priorities and responsibilities throughout your term. We also commend Mr. Mogens Lykketoft of Denmark for his able stewardship of the General Assembly during the historic 70th session. Mr. President, the year 2016 is an important year in South Africa as we mark two significant historic anniversaries in our country. We recently marked the 60th anniversary of the 1956 Women's March against discriminatory and racist laws, and the 40th anniversary of the June 16, 1976 youth uprising against apartheid. These two marked significant turning points in the history of our struggle against apartheid minority rule in our country. The Women's March in 1956 brought the gender dimension of the struggle and the equal role of women in the fight against white domination, oppression, and injustice into sharp focus. Equally, the youth uprising 40 years ago highlighted and cemented the role of young people in fighting for liberation and a better society. We are reminded of these two milestones as we address the theme of this debate, which is Sustainable Development Goals, a universal push to transform our world. Last year, world leaders marked the 70th anniversary of the United Nations by adopting the Sustainable Development Goals, also known as Agenda 2030. We committed ourselves to an ambitious and transformative global development program that seeks to address the triple challenge of this century, which is poverty, unemployment, and inequality. To a great extent, The Millennium Development Goals played a critical role in galvanizing governments and communities all over the world to put in place programs and policies aimed at poverty eradication and in addressing socio-economic development, particularly in Africa. It is a well-known reality that our continent, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, did not achieve the targets that were set in the MDGs. It was for this reason that we insisted that the Sustainable Development Goals should continue the unfinished business of the MDGs. We have an interest, therefore, in ensuring the full implementation of the SDGs as we take forward the agenda of promoting Africa's sustainable development. Mr. President, we have made significant strides in the past couple of decades in reversing the impact of underdevelopment and the legacies of colonialism and apartheid in Africa. If the African continent is to develop faster, we need to address certain constraints. This includes addressing inadequate infrastructure, the high dependency on primary products, high exposure to commodity price volatility, limited investment in research and development, science, innovation, and technology, low private sector investment, as well as the need to continue improving skills. To respond to some of these constraints, the continent has embarked on a number of initiatives. These include the new Partnership for Africa's Development, the Presidential Infrastructure Championing Initiative, the African Mining Vision, and the Program for the Infrastructure Development of Africa. In South Africa, we have put in place a national development plan which is aligned to AU Agenda 2063, as well as the UN Sustainable Development Goals. At the core of our development plan is the focus on poverty eradication and the upliftment of the standard of living of our people. Our national development plan is also in line with the drive for industrialization of Africa. This will contribute to the eradication of poverty, reduce inequality and unemployment, and will also contribute positively to global growth and prosperity. It is therefore imperative that Africa and the least developed countries, which were left behind in previous industrialization processes, must not be excluded from the fourth or new industrial revolution. Mr. President, the successful implementation of Africa's development plans depends on the availability of resources. We are therefore seriously concerned about the loss of resources of the continent through illicit financial flows. The joint African Union and UN Economic Commission for Africa's high-level panel on illicit financial flows from Africa estimates that illicit flows from Africa could be about $50 billion per annum. Illicit financial flows deprive developing countries of the much-needed economic resources to uplift their economies in order to provide infrastructure and basic services such as education and health care. We urge the world at large to treat this problem with the seriousness and urgency that it deserves. Mr. President, we also need to close the gap that has painfully divided people between the rich and the poor, and which has divided countries between big and small economies. Global inequality and economic exclusion have become a serious threat to global peace and stability. Inclusive growth is thus a peace, security, and prosperity imperative. Inclusive growth will, however, remain a distant dream if powerful nations continue to put their national interests ahead of the global collective interests. Mr. President, the African continent remains committed through the African Union and its peace and security architecture to resolve the remaining conflict areas. We have committed ourselves to silence the guns by 2020. We appeal to the United Nations Security Council in particular to support African peace operations so that we can achieve this noble goal. The situation in Libya, South Sudan, and the Central African Republic remains a continental priority. We strongly urge the United Nations Security Council to better align and coordinate with the African Union in efforts to bring about peace in these sister countries and the continent at large. Beyond the continent, we remain concerned about threats of terrorism. 15 years after the September 11 terrorist attacks on the United States, international terrorism remains a challenge that no single country or region can successfully deal with. We have witnessed the rise of ISIS and are horrified by its brutal and senseless killings. The conflicts in both Libya and Syria have provided a fertile ground for the terrorists to carry out their unjustified terrorist activities. The conflict in Syria has led to chaos in that country in under 5 years, with devastating effects on the stability of the region. The deadlock in the Security Council on the Syrian question exposes the inherent structural dysfunction of the 1945 post-Second World War consensus. We must therefore ask ourselves if the United Nations, and in particular the United Nations Security Council, as currently configured, can fulfill its mandate in addressing the challenges of the 21st century. The UN Security Council is supposed to act in our collective interests without being bogged down by domestic narrow interests of few states. It is imperative and urgent that the United Nations, and in particular the Security Council, should be reformed. South Africa has been calling for and will continue to call for the fundamental reform of the United Nations Security Council in order to ensure the representation of Africa. 1 billion people cannot continue to be denied a voice in this manner. Mr. President, the lack of progress in finding a durable solution to the Palestinian question and the Sahrawi Arab Republic's struggle for self-determination remains a major concern for us. It is important that the United Nations should carry out its historic mission in ensuring that the two longest outstanding decolonization and occupation issues are resolved once and for all in fulfillment of the United Nations chapter objectives. Mr. President, the signing of the Paris Agreement last year marked a historic moment in humanity, resolved to minimize the impact of climate change and address the human contribution to it. I would like to take this opportunity to commend our Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, for the extraordinary leadership that he provided since COP15 in Copenhagen. He remained unwavering in his commitment to see a largely binding agreement, a legally binding agreement, finally agreed to by all. The adoption of Durban platform for enhanced action during COP17 was a historic milestone and marked a turning point in the negotiation of a legally binding instrument. It provided a clear roadmap with targets and deadlines. Mr. President, on behalf of the people and government of South Africa, I would like to take this opportunity to salute the outgoing Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, for the sterling and outstanding manner with which he steered the affairs of the organization in the past decade. We wish His Excellency, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, well with his future endeavors. We are pleased that the United Nations General Assembly has, for the first time in the history of the United Nations, been at the center of the process of finding a new Secretary General. We believe in a balanced and equal role between the two principal organs on the question of the selection of the Secretary General. The General Assembly as the most representative organ representing all the aspirations of the peoples of the world, should be central in determining the right man or woman to lead the UN to the future. The UNGA cannot be expected to just rubber stamp decisions of the Security Council. South Africa is particularly supportive of the proposal to limit the term of office of the Secretary General to a 7-year non-renewable term in order to allow him or her to work without being concerned about reappointment. Mr. President, South Africa looks forward to working with you and other member states throughout this session. I thank you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of South Africa for the statement just made. May I request representatives to remain seated while we greet the President. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Muhammadu Buhari, President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome to the United Nations His Excellency Muhammadu Buhari, President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
The President of the General Assembly, His Excellency Mr. Peter Thompson, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, Your Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. President, let me, on behalf of the government and people of Nigeria, congratulate you on your well-deserved election as the President of the 71st General Assembly. I assure you of Nigeria's support in steering the affairs of the General Assembly in the next 1 year. I take the opportunity to also express my appreciation to your predecessor, Mr. Thomas Kelthoff, for the achievements recorded during his tenure. Last year, I presented my first address to the General Assembly after my assumption of office as President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Indeed, it was a remarkable year, which not only celebrated the gains of the Millennium Development Goals, but also witnessed the adoption of 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development. These landmark achievements by the global community will no doubt build a more prosperous, all-inclusive world. We must work together to liberate humanity from poverty, save our planet from the devastation of climate change, and rid the world of terrorism for a more peaceful and prosperous future. We must remain committed to taking bold steps to transform our world. The Sustainable Development Goals underscore the imperative for our collective will towards finding enduring and sustainable solutions to addressing global disparities. It is in the light of our appreciation of the enormity of the task before us that I welcome the theme of this Assembly, Sustainable Development Goals, a universal push to transform the world. Nigeria, as a developing country, has been adversely affected by the global economic downturn. We are, however, undeterred and have embarked on a wide range of reforms in our efforts to diversify our economy and shift emphasis to mining, agriculture, industrialization, manufacture development, and the creation of the enabling environment for foreign direct investment. Our strategic objective is to stimulate the economy, restore growth, and accelerate recovery. In doing this, we are taking measures to reduce the cost of governance and increase expenditure on infrastructure and ensure environmental best practices. Mr. President, fighting corruption remains a cardinal pillar of our administration. Corruption freezes development, thereby undermining the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. I am pleased that our efforts in fighting corruption are yielding positive results, including significant stolen asset recoveries. The recovered funds are being channeled towards the development of critical infrastructure and the implementation of social inclusion programs for our people. We are also strengthening our capacity of government entities to institutionalize reforms to ensure transparency and good governance. The Anti-Corruption Summit held in London in May this year served as further reassurance of the global community's commitment to fight corruption through the proposed practical steps to address the challenges, including actions to hold perpetrators to justice within the law. Nigeria supports the development of an international legal framework to enforce anti-corruption measures and strengthen existing international institutions to effectively deal with corrupt practices. Nigeria calls on member states that are yet to sign up the United Nations Convention Against Corruption to do so. Nigeria will continue to advocate for the facilitation of the recovery of illicit financial assets. Indeed, the speedy and unconditional return of stolen public assets should be the focus of the follow-up anti-corruption conference to be hosted by the United States and United Kingdom in Washington next year. Furthermore, Nigeria remains committed to extradite industries, transparency initiative, a global coalition which promotes transparency and accountability in the management of revenues from the oil, gas, and solid mineral sectors. We voluntarily signed up to Active Industries Transparency Initiative because we are convinced that transparent governance is an imperative for resource-rich developing countries like ours. Through the work that our national chapter of Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative has done over the years, it is clear that our faith is not misplaced. The National Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative has been empowering citizens with critical information they can use to hold the government and other players in the industries to account and make recommendations that drive reforms in these strategic sectors of our national life. Mr. President, the world took a giant step in Paris towards addressing the challenges of climate change. Nigeria is proud to have been part of the process leading to the adoption of the Paris Agreement in December 2015 at the 21st meeting of the Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. COP21 marked a watershed in the global community's commitment to address climate change, and we will continue in our determined efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. At the center of Nigeria's climate action is our determination to implement the strategies and our intended nationally determined conditions, which will foster low-carbon economy and sustainable growth in building a climate-resilient society. We are creating public awareness through the integrated involvement of the private sector and civil society, and strengthening national institutions and mechanisms. The negative consequences of climate change have manifested in the drying up of our Lake Chad. The means of livelihood of an estimated 30 million inhabitants of the Lake Chad Basin spread across Cameroon, Chad, Niger, Nigeria are being severely threatened. The cost of replenishing the lake has been put at $14 billion United States dollars under a 5-year plan which should be accorded global attention. Nigeria also supports the African Union initiative on the Great Green Wall to hold desertification. In furtherance of our commitment to environmental sustainability, Nigeria has launched the Clean Up of Ogoni land in Nigeria's Niger Delta, based on 2011 environmental assessment of the area by the United Nations Environment Programme. Multinational oil companies operating in the area will be required to live up to their corporate social responsibilities and contribute to the cleaning up of the environment degraded as a result of their activities and operations. We call on development partners and the multinationals to support our efforts through the Ogoni Land Restoration Fund. Mr. President, the 21st century has been marked by the rising insecurity unleashed by global terrorism and violent extremism, which constitute a real threat to the international community. With the global increase in the spate of terrorist attacks, there is now more than ever before international consensus and greater willingness to collaborate in combating this threat. Indeed, we are meeting at the time when our hosts, the American people, have just marked the 15th anniversary of the tragic and deadly terrorist attack on their soil. We in Nigeria, having been victims of terrorism ourselves, fully understand in the impact of 9/11 on the American psyche and the families of the thousands of innocent victims whose lives were lost that day. I therefore reiterate the Nigerian government's and people's sympathies to the American people and prayers for the families of the victims that they may heal and find closure soon. We hope that justice will be done to the families of victims of 9/11, as indeed to the victims of terror everywhere, in conformity with the norms of international justice. As we seek justice for terror victims, the international community should avoid reacting in the heat of deep emotions of the moment by taking unilateral measures, legal or otherwise, that will have a negative and disruptive impact on the international community's collective efforts to fight terrorism. We should not be distracted in our collective resolve to beat back terrorism in all its forms. As we confront terror, we must also commit to stopping the proliferation of small arms and light weapons, which nurture its spread. To this end, Nigeria urges member states that are yet to sign and ratify the Arms Trade Treaty to do so without further delay. Nigeria has made remarkable progress in our resolve to defeat Boko Haram, whose capacity to launch orchestrated attacks as a formed group has been severely degraded. In the last few months, their operations have been limited to sporadic use of improvised explosive devices against soft targets. Nigeria has continued to combat terrorism based on the established rules of engagement and in conformity with international best practices. I take this opportunity to reaffirm Nigeria's commitment to human rights norms and international humanitarian law in our efforts to counter terrorism and violent extremism. I also wish to restate the assurance that the federal government of Nigeria is employing all our judicial tools to investigate and treat reported cases of human rights violations. I commend the contribution of our neighbors, Benin Republic, Republic of Cameroon, Republic of Chad, and Republic of Niger, whose combined efforts under the multinational joint task force accomplished the present return of normalcy in areas hitherto occupied by Boko Haram. May I also thank our international partners, including France, the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, the United Nations, ECOWAS, the African Union, and many other multilateral and bilateral partners for their invaluable support. Our experience today is evidence that with determined international collaboration, terrorism can be defeated. Mr. President, the flow of refugees and migrants worldwide has attained alarming proportions. In this wise, Nigeria supports the ceasefire agreement brokered by the United States and Russia to end the atrocious tragedy of the Syrian civil war. Of particular concern to us in Nigeria is the plight of internally displaced persons arising from Boko Haram terrorism. We have taken concrete steps to address their humanitarian needs and to ensure that necessary conditions are established to enable the voluntary return of the displaced persons to their places of abode in safety and dignity. Mr. President, at the same time, the Palestinian issue, despite years and years of international efforts, is no nearer to being resolved. Nigeria, in company with member states of the African Union, firmly support the two-state solution with Palestinian rights to statehood and conformity with numerous Security Council resolutions, beginning with Resolution 242 of 1967. Let me seize this opportunity to once again thank all United Nations and other aid agencies and development partners currently deployed in northeastern Nigeria. I reaffirm Nigeria's commitment to collective action towards an effective global response to address the root causes of refugee flows worldwide. Mr. President, we acknowledge the importance of youth in national development and remain committed to harnessing the potential of the increasing youth bulge. We must take advantage of the numbers and creative energy of young people who are in the majority in Nigeria and in most other member states. Therefore, at the international level, we call for the establishment of a specialized United Nations agency for youth development to achieve this strategic objective. Nuclear security remains central to our quest for durable peace and security. This was why I participated in the 5th Nuclear Security Summit hosted by President Barack Obama in Washington in March 2016. Nigeria and the other peace-loving member states of the United Nations must continue to uphold the fundamental principles of nuclear disarmament, non-proliferation, and its peaceful uses. Mr. President, the United Nations should now redouble the long protracted effort for its reform to enable it to effectively address the challenges of our times. Nigeria therefore reiterates its call for the reform of the United Nations Security Council, in particular to reflect equitable and fair representation and greater transparency, legitimacy, and inclusiveness in its decision-making. Africa should be adequately represented on the United Nations Security Council in the permanent member category. In this regard, Nigeria stands ready to serve Africa and the world on a reformed Security Council to advance international peace and security. Mr. President, let me conclude by reaffirming Nigeria's abiding faith in the United Nations and in her capacity to support member states to deliver on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. I thank you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria for the statement just made. May I request representatives to remain seated while we greet the President.
C'était la première partie des débats de cette première journée de l'Assemblée générale de l'ONU. Nous allons marquer une courte pause. On se retrouve dans quelques instants.